All right, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to this Microfocus and Osterman Research webinar today. My name is Q Mangus. I'm a product marketing manager here at Microfocus, and I'll be hosting you today. Um, we're excited to bring you this topic. Well, it looks like we have a large number of people on the call, and we're really excited for this webinar on strategies for archiving in hybrid environments. And of course, we're always pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. He will be leading the discussion today, the presentation. And Michael is an industry expert and is the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech industry and has spent 16 of those years specifically following messaging in the collaboration industry. So, of course, he's an expert on this topic, and we're really excited for him to be here. A few things just to take note of. If you do have questions, we're going to have some time at the end for a Q&A session. But if you have questions as we're going through, feel free to put those through in the question panel there in the GoToWebinar, and we'll get to those at the end. And of course, as we get to the end as well, you can place them there as well, and we'll address those questions. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and give the time over to Michael. And once again, we're glad that he could join us. And Michael, the time is yours.
Well, Q, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everybody who's here with us today. We're going to be discussing, as Q mentioned, hybrid archiving in hybrid environments. And this is a really important issue on a number of levels, not only because it's archiving, which in and of itself is important, but also there's the changing nature of archiving, how things are moving to the cloud, but still remaining on premise. So why don't we get right into it? Just a little bit about Osterman Research so you understand our perspective in all this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, as Q had mentioned, and we're really very focused on the way people communicate and collaborate in the workplace. We focus obviously on the messaging industry like email, social media, and so forth, but also the web and collaboration industries, really trying to understand how people communicate, how they collaborate, how they share information. And one of the things we do is really focus heavily on what the industry is doing. So we do a lot of primary research. We talk to IT managers, email administrators, records managers, people who are in the trenches, really trying to develop strategies for their organizations in the context of how they preserve information, how they secure it, and so forth. The company was founded in 2001, and we're based near Seattle. And unfortunately, Seattle looks nothing like that picture today. We're our typical overcast for most of the winter. So why don't we get right into it? Archiving certainly is becoming more important. It is a best practice for any industry. We tend to hear about how archiving is critical for financial services or healthcare, life sciences, energy, maybe a few other more heavily regulated industries. But fundamentally, archiving is a best practice for any organization, whether you're a mom and pop retail store or a General Motors or a government agency, what have you, you must archive information. And we're going to be publishing a list of archiving regulations beginning next week that really attempts to underscore just how important archiving is for any organization out there, regardless of the industry, regardless of your size, and so forth. Now, there are a number of drivers, and we'll get into some of the major drivers here in just a moment. But fundamentally, the big five, if you want to call it that, are legal or contractual requirements to keep data for specified periods. Maybe you have a legal obligation that's been recommended by legal counsel based on court precedent that says you have to keep certain types of documents 3 years, certain types of documents 7 years, and so forth. There's also compliance with regulatory obligations. Again, if you're a very heavily regulated organization, like a broker-dealer in the financial services industry, some sort of a healthcare practitioner, if you're an energy company of some kind, if you're in life sciences, maybe you're a pharmaceutical company, you have very specific retention obligations for certain types of data. However, there's a mindset out there that you don't really have to archive data if you're not in a regulated industry. And we still see a lot of organizations, even some very large enterprises, that do not archive their data. The fundamental issue is that every organization, regardless of industry, has to keep data for a certain length of time. You have a regulatory obligation to do that as well as legal ones. Also, there's an important role for archiving in the context of things like disaster recovery or business continuity. We're all going to face, some sort of a disaster at some point, a power outage, a weather event. Regardless of what it is, there's going to be a need to be able to recover data. And this is not just backup so you can get a server up and running. This is true business continuity so that you can maybe rely on your archive as the source of information for a backup email system until the primary facilities get back on their feet. E-discovery, another major driver for archiving. All of us are going to have to go through a legal action, at some point in the future, whether you're a third party to it or you're directly involved, and you're going to have to be able to produce data. That might be for a wrongful termination suit. It could be for, some sort of a product liability case, you name it. If you are in the United States, and also in many other countries, litigation is really just sort of a fact of business life. And then finally, litigation holds, closely related to e-discovery. If you, for example, in the United States, get wind that a lawsuit is coming, that even if nothing has been filed, but you get a sense, if you have information that says you're going to be involved in a lawsuit, you have to place certain data on hold. And the only really reliable way to do that is with an archiving system. Now, what's important to note is that each of these drivers, even all of the secondary drivers, if you want to call it that, down below, are all becoming more important. We did a survey in October, and we asked organizations, to what extent are each of these major drivers for deploying and maintaining an archiving system in your organization. And as you can see here in the yellow bars, these were the 2017 figures. We then asked decision makers, what about 2 years out? How important are these drivers going to be? And what's noteworthy here is that every single one of these drivers is going to become more important over time. So archiving, again, is a best practice today. It's going to become an even more important best practice in the future. So let's get a little bit into some of these key drivers. Certainly the big five. Legal and contractual requirements. Again, you're going to be involved in contracts. You're going to be retaining lots of business records in email, on mobile devices, in your file shares, really in a wide variety of sources, even social media in some cases. And you're going to have an obligation to preserve the business records. And those business records might be records of communications between clients, with outside auditors. It could be with legal counsel. Really, if it's a business record as part of a contract, or is something that potentially could be part of litigation in the future, you really have an obligation to archive that content, be able to search on it in a tamper-proof archive, and then produce the necessary results. Similarly with regulatory compliance. Again, every organization out there has some sort of a legal obligation to protect data, but also a regulatory one. And again, this is not just for regulated versus unregulated industries. This is for every organization. Things like personnel records, even vacation requests from your employees have a regulatory compliance obligation associated with them. You have to preserve that data for at least 1 year. Storage management and performance is another issue. It's becoming a little bit less important now as email goes to the cloud, but it still becomes an important issue so that you can clear things out of users' inboxes, for example, place them into an archive, and make the endpoint faster and more reliable, particularly if you have to restore that, maybe after a ransomware attack or a hard disk crashes. It's much easier to restore if there's less data on the endpoint and most of the data is stored in an archive. End-user self-service is another important aspect of archiving that some organizations don't take very seriously, but they really should. When users are working on an email, when they're producing a proposal, when they're trying to find out what happened with the relationship of the past client, it's important to allow the user to go into his or her archive and really extract the information they need. There's a wealth of information in an archive about information flows, about past dealings with clients, and this is particularly important if you are a replacement for somebody who's just left the company. You can go back into their archive, find out exactly what they said to clients, what promises were made, maybe what complaints clients had, you name it. And you can access all of this information and gain a wealth of information that you're not going to find anywhere else but in an email archive or maybe an archive of things like file shares or text messages. And then finally, knowledge management. Organizations need to preserve a record of what goes on in the organization. If you look at turnover rates in the United States, for example, they're currently at about 24%, which means that every year about 1 out of every 4 employees will leave your organization, and they take a lot of corporate memory with them. There's a lot of information, a lot of value that they possess that really isn't anywhere else but in an archive. And if you don't have access to that information, if you don't have access to that collective intelligence, you're going to be at a pretty serious disadvantage moving forward. So it's absolutely essential that you preserve all of that corporate memory in an archive. So let's talk a little bit about the GDPR. And the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation that's going to go into effect in the European Union on May 25th, 2018. This is going to be a replacement for the current Data Protection Directive that went into effect in the late 1990s. And fundamentally, the GDPR is about really sort of expanding the rights of data subjects and then harmonizing all of the various data protection regulations that today exist across all of the member states of the EU. And it's important to understand that fundamentally the GDPR is about the rights of data subjects, and it's about their right to sort of their self-determination. It's not about Equifax owning your data or a company owning your data or the government owning it. It's about you as the owner of that data having the rights to determine how it's processed, where it's processed, and so forth. So if we can go to the next slide, please. There are a number of really important GDPR issues that you need to take note of, and all of these can be addressed in many cases with a robust archiving system. And it's something that a lot of organizations can't do today because they don't have an archive, and so they're going to be at a serious disadvantage in the context of GDPR. Now, one of the fundamental issues to understand is that GDPR applies to you if, regardless of where you are in the world, if you possess data on a European Union data subject. So if somebody is living in France or Germany or Poland, you absolutely have to preserve that data and protect it. You have to be able to encrypt it and make sure you can change it and delete it and so forth. And the only way to really reliably do that is with an archiving system. So some of the key issues in GDPR, first and foremost, is the subject access request. Today, under the current Data Protection Directive, individuals have a right to go to a company in the EU and say, I'd like to have all of the information you possess about me. So, every item on a form that you filled out, all of the customer information, if you filled out a prospect form, regardless of what it is, that organization has an obligation to provide it to you at a relatively nominal fee. Under the GDPR, they still have to do that, but now they have to do it for free. So if you go to a company in France and say, I want all of the information you have on me, the company has only 1 month to provide it to you, and they have to do it at no charge. One of the fundamental problems with subject access requests is that organizations today don't have, in many cases, really good archiving systems. And so trying to find all of this data in the first place is very difficult, and trying to produce it in a form that that's going to be available to the data subject is even more difficult without robust archiving capabilities. There's an insurance company I've heard about recently that has 16 full-time people working on subject access requests, and they can process fewer than 8 per day. Now, if you look at the potential for damage to an organization, if they can't access their information, if they can't respond to subject access requests, they can get penalized by the EU. And some of those fines can be absolutely enormous and will be very painful. So it's absolutely essential that you have a robust archiving capability that will allow you to respond quickly and inexpensively to subject access requests. Also, under the GDPR, there's the right to rectify and complete. Organizations have an obligation to correct any erroneous information they have on data subjects, and also to complete it. Maybe they have incomplete information about a person's credit profile, maybe their home ownership, whatever the case may be. Data subjects have the right to have that information corrected and completed. There's also the right to be forgotten. Individual data subjects can go to a company and say, I'd like you to expunge all of the data you have on me. Now, there are some exceptions. They're under contract with you for, warranty type contracts or, whatever the case may be. The organization has a right to keep certain types of data. But if you responded to, an offer the company made and they're just possessing information about you, you have the right to ask that company to completely delete that information. And again, an archiving system is the best way to find that information and then properly manage it. You have to keep absolutely excellent records. A key part of the GDPR is maintaining very good records about everything you've done with data that's data subjects. And again, an archive is going to be a key component and one of the best ways to do that, because now you can properly manage all of the data you have on data subjects. And finally, you have to maintain very good safeguards, things like encryption and protection of the data at every stage, at rest, in transit, and while it's in use. So again, there are going to be lots of technologies that are going to be used as part of the GDPR, but it's absolutely essential that you have robust archiving, because that's going to be a central focal point for most organizations in the context of how they gather and protect and manage all of that information. So let's look at how archiving is evolving. Fundamentally, what we're looking at here is that today most data that is archived on premises. We have, legacy systems that are managing archives using in-house servers, in-house software, and so forth. What we're finding is, this shift toward the cloud. And we've been seeing this over the past several years, where a growing proportion of corporate data is stored in the cloud as part of an archiving system. And we've seen that, literally for about the last 10 years, but it really has picked up steam over just the last couple of years. So again, this came from the October survey that I mentioned. And what we asked is, for things like corporate email, that is, part of an on-premises system, something like Microsoft Exchange, user files, invoices, security audit logs, and you can see the list here. How is this archived today? Is it archived in some sort of an on-premise system, or do you archive it in the cloud? And how is this going to change over the next couple of years? Well, as you can see, there's really a decided shift toward archiving content in the cloud, particularly for things like user files, corporate on-premises email, security audit logs, project data, content from collaboration tools, and so forth. So we're seeing this very decided shift away from on-premises solutions and toward the cloud. Now, what's particularly noteworthy here, though, is that despite the success of the cloud and the fact that cloud-based archiving is growing at a much faster rate than on-premises archiving, still a couple years out, we see a very substantial proportion of archived data still on premises. Now, that's partly old legacy systems that organizations just don't want to update. They don't want to migrate data from an old legacy system to a cloud-based system, particularly if there's going to be a lot of cost associated with the migration, and if the data is not going to be frequently accessed. It's important to note, though, that on-premises solutions still play an active role in the content that users are going to on a daily basis as part of an end-user self-service scheme. Lots of content for e-discovery or regulatory compliance is still stored on premises. So it's absolutely essential to understand that yes, archiving in the cloud is really sort of the future of archiving, but archiving on premises is going to be here for many years to come. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the key changes we're talking about here, certainly the archiving of electronic content of all types is growing over time. Most organizations, for example, will start with email. It's a primary source of corporate information that users, store information in. They store contacts, attachments. Lots of business intelligence is stored in email, and organizations, rightly in most cases, will start their archiving journey with email. But it's important to note that there are other content types that are increasing in importance in the context of archiving. Things like text messages. There's a growing proportion of business records that are stored on text messaging systems. People are sharing data with clients. They're sharing files. They're doing all sorts of things in the context of text messaging, almost always with a mobile device. We see lots of information on file shares, information that organizations organizations are keeping maybe from SharePoint or just as part of normal document preservation. We're seeing things like social media archiving becoming more important as organizations are sharing data, sharing business records and social media. So the archiving of electronic content, really of a growing number of data types, is increasing over time. Also, because archiving is shifting to the cloud, that's sort of following the pattern, if you will, of applications in general. We're seeing, for example, great success in Office 365, migrating users from on-premises Exchange. It doesn't mean on-premises Exchange is going away, but it does mean that Office 365 is going to capture a larger and larger share of that over time. We're seeing the same thing with Google Docs, Google Apps, lots of cloud-based solutions in the CRM space, ERP, and so forth. More and more of these applications are moving to the cloud, and so archiving is following suit. The business records that you're generating and storing in the cloud, are very often best preserved in an archiving system, also in the cloud. It's important to note, though, that on-premises archiving is going to continue to be important. It's not going away. People are still deploying on-premises archiving solutions, and they're storing lots of corporate data on-premises, behind their own firewall, and for a variety of reasons that we'll get into here in just a bit. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, we're seeing this fairly significant shift to the cloud. Again, this is reflecting the general trend toward adoption of the cloud for really a wide variety of core applications that are essential to business operations. We're also seeing the increasing maturity of cloud archiving solutions. There's more flexibility in many of these solutions than there was just a couple of years ago, more capabilities, more data types can be archived, and really just sort of the increasing acceptance of hybrid archiving solutions, where organizations won't abandon on-premises, but they will supplement it with the cloud. So for maybe a headquarters location, you'll want to maintain the legacy on-premises archiving solution, but for all of your satellite offices where you don't necessarily have dedicated IT staff, maybe it makes more sense to go with a cloud archiving solution and then combine the two in a hybrid offering. What we're seeing here is that the proportion of corporate content that's archived in the cloud is increasing. You can see here that in 2017, about a third of all corporate content, and this came from the October survey, about a third of all corporate content is today archived in the cloud. That's going to be well over half of content in just a couple of years' time. And we expect this trend to continue over the next several years as more and more content gets archived in the cloud. But again, it's important to note that on-premises is not going away for many years to come. And so the hybrid archiving model really is going to be the norm. Next slide, please. So in terms of hybrid archiving, there really are a number of scenarios where a lot of decision makers are simply more comfortable with hybrid archiving than with going completely to the cloud or even staying completely with on-premises. For example, data sovereignty is an absolutely important issue in a lot of places. In Canada, in Europe, and in other places around the world, where you have to keep data within a certain geography. You can't transfer it just anywhere in the world. And so having a hybrid archiving solution where you have data sovereignty protected, maybe in an on-premises solution, but you then use cloud for other types of data may be called for. There may be specific regulatory requirements in a certain industry that require absolute protection of the data. And again, decision makers feel a bit more comfortable in keeping things on premises. Now, that doesn't mean you can't protect data and can't satisfy your regulatory obligations with a cloud-based archiving solution, but a lot of decision makers simply feel more comfortable in having at least some of their data archived behind their own firewall on their own servers. Again, getting back to this issue of the presence or absence of IT staff, it may be in your organization you don't have dedicated IT staff at satellite locations, remote offices, particularly for individuals who work from home and so forth. And so it simply makes sense to archive data in the cloud and let a specialist provider take care of that for you, simply because you don't have the dedicated IT staff on premises to deal with issues as they come up. It may be that you have highly sensitive data, financial projections, or whatever the case may be, And a lot of decision makers we found in our research simply are more comfortable with maintaining that data on premises in an on-premises archiving solution where it doesn't go to the cloud and where they can maintain absolute control behind their own firewall, or at least as much control as is possible. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's the maintenance of legacy archives. A lot of older data, particularly if it gets to be 6 months to a year or older, it's important to maintain that legacy archive because it just doesn't pay to move it to the cloud in most cases. You're going to access it infrequently. You're keeping it just in case you get sued or in case you go through a regulatory audit, and you don't have users accessing it on a regular basis for that self-service aspect I mentioned earlier. And so it just makes sense to keep that hybrid archive and maintain it properly just in case you need that data in the future. Again, that's going to be a less important issue over time, but it is important because a lot of organizations have to keep data for many, many years. So in terms of the strategies for hybrid archiving, really they're varied. We asked in the October survey, do you really want a hybrid platform if you're going to be considering one to be from a single vendor? Should it be single sourced? And what we found is that about half of those we surveyed, and these were decision makers in mid-sized and large organizations, primarily in North America, about half believe that on-premises and cloud archiving solutions should come from the same vendor. And it makes sense because you're dealing with one entity instead of two. You don't have compatibility or configuration issues and so forth. And that doesn't mean that you can't have multiple vendors, one for on-premises, one for cloud, for example. But a lot of decision makers are simply more comfortable having a single vendor to manage both aspects of their archiving. 17%, about 1 out of 6 organizations, told us that our on-premises and cloud archiving solutions should come from different vendors. For example, if you're using Office 365, maybe it makes sense to have some archiving within Office 365, but maybe your most sensitive or most critical data in another vendor's archiving repository. That way, if Office 365 goes down, you still have a completely separate cloud infrastructure to deal with your archive. And it makes sense in a lot of cases, not to have all of your eggs in one basket, and a lot of decision makers agree with that. 23% of organizations said makes no difference at all. They really don't care, if they're the same, the hybrid solution is from the same vendor or not. Just they'll go with anything. And 10% simply weren't sure. So a lot of decision makers, are still up in the air about exactly how to implement hybrid archiving if they have plans to do that. So in terms of some of the important issues you need to consider, certainly focus on the benefits of geo-redundancy. It's absolutely important that you fully appreciate the advantages of geo-redundancy for your archive. So if you're going to be having some sort of a hybrid archiving solution or plans to do that, it makes sense to have an archive in a fundamentally different location from where you're located in case you have to use that archive maybe as part of a backup email system. There can be lower cost of ownership with hybrid archiving, particularly if you maintain legacy archives and you've already made the investments in the server and in software to maintain the on-premises archive. You can do new stuff in the cloud, so fundamentally lowering your overall cost of ownership for archiving. There can be bandwidth optimization. In some parts of the world, bandwidth is not cheap and it's certainly not plentiful, and it makes sense to maintain some part of your hybrid of your archiving infrastructure on premises and some in the cloud so that you can reduce the amount of bandwidth that's required to send data up to the cloud for archiving. You do have a lot of flexibility with a hybrid archiving solution. You can slowly migrate data to the cloud if you want. You can maintain stuff on premises. You can maintain only certain data types in the cloud. You do have a lot of options with the typical hybrid archiving solution that you would not have if you went strictly cloud or strictly on premises. You can also gain independence from individual cloud applications. Going back to the example of Office 365, if you want to maintain your archive in a separate archiving repository, which we recommend in a lot of cases, it gives you independence from the Microsoft infrastructure. And that's not a knock on Microsoft, but it simply makes sense to separate, in many cases, your archived data from your production data. Because it's important to be able to have that independence in case one of those infrastructures goes down. Also, you can have improved capabilities for data analytics. There are some archiving solutions out there that provide really good analytics capabilities. And that's sort of a segue into what we call next generation archiving, where instead of treating archiving as sort of an insurance policy, just in case you need your data for e-discovery or litigation holds or some sort of a regulatory audit, you can begin to use your data to extract business intelligence out of it. There's an enormous amount of information within archives about your clients, about your employees, about how they share information, about how customer service requests come in, and the list just goes on and on. And if you have good business intelligence capabilities where you can extract intelligence out of those archives, you can gain a lot of competitive advantage for your organization. And we won't get into the details of that now, but there are some really good archiving solutions in the cloud that will allow you to do those analytics that organizations really should be doing as part of their due diligence and their best practice. And then finally, with a hybrid solution, you can have a single archiving platform for both the cloud and on premises. And that makes sense if you're searching, for example, for e-discovery. If you can search the cloud and on premises through a single interface, that's going to make your legal team, your compliance team much more efficient than if you have to search through multiple archives. So in summary, there's really a growing proportion of electronic content that's going to be archived in the cloud over the next 24 months. Cloud archiving is growing at a much faster rate than on premises. And a lot of organizations we found are considering and seriously considering a hybrid archiving solution instead of going just with on premises or just in the cloud. There are a number of important benefits that we've discussed from hybrid archiving. And so that's it for my presentation. If you would like more information, if you have any questions that come up after the fact, here's our contact information. And Q, I'm going to hand things back to you now.
Thank you, Michael. Great information. And yeah, as Michael said, here's his information up there if you have any other questions. And once again, feel free to put your questions through in the question panel there, and we will get to them. I just have one minor thing that I want to finish up with here while we're waiting for some questions. Is I just want to talk a little bit about the solution that Micro Focus offers here in Retain Unified Archiving. And as Michael talked about, is there's a shift in what people are archiving and the way that they do it and this next generation archiving. And that's where Retain can assist you. And it's a solution that we'd love for you to take a look at and consider. And we like to call it Retain Unified Archiving because we do have a central archive of all email. So multiple email systems are supported, as you can kind of see in this circle. Mobile communication is supported, social media and instant messaging. And all that information is archived into that one central archive. And we give you tools to perform e-discovery to get to that information. As we've said, that archiving is no longer about taking that information and sticking it in the corner and hopefully you don't have to ever get to it. Archiving is more of a living, breathing thing where you can use the data for analytics and information about what's going on in your company, and Retain gives you those tools to be able to do that. So that's a little bit about Retain. If you'd like more information about that, of course, feel free to reach out to us. We do have some time for some questions, so I'm going to go through and see if there's any. Please feel free to put those through, and we will get to them here. So we'll give it just a moment and see if there's any that are teed up here. I'm not seeing any right now. We'll give it just one more moment here. So, Michael, you'd mentioned something about regulations and the different regulations that people see, and you're publishing something. Could you maybe give us a brief overview of like some regulations and kind of what they're requiring in terms of what people need to be archiving?
Sure, absolutely. If you go through the code or the Federal Register, the CFR in the United States, we have identified about 2,000 different regulations that require organizations to preserve data. And it really cuts across all industries and really across all data types. So things even as inconsequential as shipping orders or employee policy manuals, things of that nature, have to be preserved for a certain length of time. Now, it's rare when there's a regulation that says you have to preserve things in their native format. So, for example, if you have a shipping label or a shipping document of some kind, it can be stored electronically, it can be stored on paper, really just about in any format. The government doesn't specify that you have to preserve, information in its native format. There are some obligations to do that, for example, in the financial services industry, but because more and more information is electronic, because it's generated in an ERP system or CRM or whatever, it simply makes sense to store that data in its native format so that you can search on it more easily. It's just more efficient for storage. It's more efficient for production and so forth. So, in the context of federal regulations, as I mentioned, there's at least 2,000 that we know of. There are also requirements at the state level. Just about every state has open records laws or sunshine laws, freedom of information laws, and so forth. And state government agencies of all types, as well as lots of cities around the United States, have to be able to preserve information. So if there are meetings of city council meetings or records of city council meetings, if there are various types of documents and so forth, it's absolutely essential that you preserve that, because there are Freedom of Information Act rights that individuals have to be able to go and access that information. So, again, there are literally thousands of regulations. And then, on top of that are all the best practices. There are the, sort of requirements, if you will, that are recommended by legal counsel based on court precedent. It may be, for example, that certain types of employee records have only a 1-year obligation for retention according to some government regulation, but your legal counsel may say you better keep these things for 4 years in case we get a wrongful termination suit, or in case there's some sort of an action that takes place because courts are going back this number of years for the records. So really there are thousands of obligations that organizations have, some at the regulatory level, some at just sort of the best practice or legal advice level.
Great question. Then another one was kind of about costs. What kind of cost savings have you seen organizations experience when they move to the cloud, or do they usually see a cost savings?
Very often they can, and it's in large part because if, for example, you're going to implement a new archiving system, you don't have the upfront costs of the servers, the software, all of the labor to set things up, to configure things properly, and so forth. Very often you can set up cloud archiving within a couple of hours, and or at least a day, and start preserving all of this information. So you get the cost savings primarily from the fact that you are avoiding lots of the upfront costs, and also you can get up to speed much more quickly, and so you don't have the cost of essentially waiting for the archiving capability to be implemented.
Great. You talked about other types of data that needs to be archived, like social media and mobile. Have you seen organizations implementing that? Is there still kind of a lag in people doing that, or is that something that you've seen more people doing?
Yeah. There's actually a pretty serious lag in that. We find email archiving is very common. File archiving is relatively common. But when you get into things like text messaging archiving, social media archiving, those are not nearly as widely deployed. You do see a lot of it in the financial services space. FINRA, for example, has mandated that you have to preserve text messaging if it's being used in a business context. So a broker dealer that's communicating with a client has to preserve that text message just like they would an email or physical correspondence, what have you. We are seeing more and more court cases where social media is being called for. There are cases where, as part of discovery, either the plaintiff or defendant will have to produce Facebook posts, tweets, whatever the case may be. So it's important to preserve the business records there, particularly in the context of things that are either controversial or potentially damaging to an organization. we recommend, just as a best practice, that organizations preserve as much social media content as they can, even if it's not for a specific legal requirement or a regulatory obligation, just to be able to see what's going on with social media. As a fun exercise, and it might not be so fun if it's your organization that's mentioned, but go through, just Twitter and look for, in quotes, "my client is stupid." And you see a lot of people in companies tweeting about their clients or tweeting about fellow employees in ways they really shouldn't be. And it's useful to go through and really understand the dangers that social media can present. And archiving is a good way to do that, because if you're preserving the social media content that's flowing through your corporate network, you can actually do searches on it and find out if there are problems that you need to address proactively.
So, what have you seen that companies do when it comes to, like, when we were talking about mobile, when it comes to BYOD, like employees bringing their own device? How do you see companies dealing with that when it comes to archiving?
Yeah, that's a really thorny issue. Because you get into employee privacy rights and the potential for pulling down data that actually belongs to an employee and not to the employer, and so forth. I think the fundamental issue you have to address first is not the technology but the policy. And you have to have really good acceptable use policies that allow the employer some rights to monitor content on the corporate networks. If BYOD devices, personally owned devices, are being used for accessing corporate email, the organization has to have the right to be able to go in and inspect that content. So, it really needs to be a policy issue. And, you can have a rule that there will be no use of personal devices for accessing corporate resources like online CRM or email or whatever the case is, and you're probably not going to have very much success with that as an employer. Employees are going to do it anyway because they want access to their information, and very often the IT department isn't going to be able to afford to buy everybody an iPhone 10. So, people are going to want the iPhone 10, but they still want to access corporate email on it. And so you get into some potentially thorny issues. A lot of organizations are using containerization, where they'll have a business side of the BYOD device or the personally owned device, and they'll have the personal side, and the organization can actually go through and wipe the business side so that if the employee leaves or if the device is lost, at least the corporation is protected and they can delete the sensitive data that might be on the employee's personal device.
Great, wonderful, and of course we have some solutions there that Microfocus offers, both in secure containerized apps with one of our solutions there, and then we also have a dual persona type solution for mobile devices through a partnership we have with Celltrust. So there's some options here that we can offer as well. That's all the questions I can see for now. I just wanted to make note that everybody who attended this webinar will also get a copy of the white paper that goes along with this webinar. And so look for that, and look for the recording of this webinar as well to hit your inbox here soon. Thanks again to Michael Osterman for your time and for your presentation. Great information, and thanks everyone for your participation. And we'll end with that, and hope to see you on the next one.